The cabin had been standing by the lake long before the gated community even existed. Its cedar walls bore the marks of weather and time, etched with the kind of quiet dignity that only decades of wind, rain, and sunlight could leave behind. To most, it was an old fishing cabin, small, unassuming, and probably not worth much more than the land it sat on. But to Ethan, it was a family heirloom, a relic of his grandfather's hands, and the one place that had never changed, no matter how much the world around it did. When Ethan drove up that Friday morning, the mist was still rolling off the water, curling around the trees like pale smoke. The lake was glassy, unbroken except for the occasional ripple of a fish breaking the surface. He parked his truck, stepped out, and inhaled the scent of pine and damp earth. It was perfect. Or it should have been. He didn't know it yet, but across the narrow gravel road, hidden behind her decorative hedges and pastel-painted porch swing, she was already watching. Her name was Margaret Hollingsworth, though everyone in the community called her Marge, or more quietly, Karen of Clearwater Cove. She was the self-appointed head of the HOA's Community Preservation Committee, a title she had invented herself when the actual HOA board refused to create one. She saw herself as the guardian of neighborhood standards, and to her, everything that happened near her lake required her oversight. When Ethan began unloading tools from the back of his truck, a drill, a toolbox, a set of new locks, Marge's blinds flicked open like a pair of suspicious eyes. She didn't recognize his truck, and in her mind, that was enough reason to be concerned. Her community had rules she had memorized, enforced, and, on more than one occasion, rewritten. The cabin sat right at the edge of what used to be public land, but was now claimed, at least in her mind, by the Clearwater Lake HOA. She didn't know the truth, and perhaps she didn't want to. All she saw was a man she didn't approve of, tampering with something she thought belonged to the neighborhood. Ethan, meanwhile, worked quietly. The old doorframe creaked as he replaced the rusted hinges. He installed a new deadbolt, then tested it twice. The previous lock had been broken for months, maybe years. Teenagers sometimes snuck in, leaving behind beer cans and cigarette butts. Once, he'd even found tire tracks where someone had backed their ATV right up to the porch. Not anymore, he thought. The cabin would finally be secure. He didn't notice Marge crossing the street until her shadow fell across the steps. She was wearing gardening gloves and clutching a clipboard. Always a clipboard, as if authority itself had to be documented. Ethan barely looked up as she stood at the foot of the stairs, hands on her hips, mouth tightening into a thin line. He ignored her. He kept working. He had every right to. But to Marge, silence was defiance. She retreated without a word, but the look on her face said it all. This was not over. By noon, Ethan was done. The locks were installed, the windows sealed, and a small solar-powered light now hung by the porch, illuminating the path down to the dock. He sat for a while on the old rocking chair his grandfather had built, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. The wind picked up across the water, bringing with it the faint scent of smoke from a distant campfire. Birds called out across the lake. For a few moments, everything was still. Then he heard the sirens. At first, he thought it must be an accident on the county road. Maybe a deer collision or a stranded boater. But the sound grew closer, sharper, until two sheriff's cruisers pulled up behind his truck. The gravel crackled under their tires as they stopped, and before Ethan could even stand, Marge appeared again, this time waving her clipboard like a victory flag. He realized, in that moment, exactly what had happened. Marge had called the cops. To her, Ethan was a trespasser, a vandal, some outsider breaking into her community's property. And she had done what she always did. She'd taken it upon herself to enforce order. The deputies stepped out, calm but alert. They looked around, taking in the cabin, the tools, the freshly installed lock. Ethan explained, patiently, clearly that the cabin was his, that it had been deeded to him by his grandfather, who'd owned the parcel since the 1960s. He even showed them the paperwork he kept in his truck. Marge's face fell when one of the deputies examined the documents. But she wasn't done. She started pointing toward the property line, insisting that the HOA's bylaws prohibited unapproved modifications and that community structures required HOA consent. The deputy simply told her that the HOA's rules didn't apply to private property outside its boundary. The cabin, as it turned out, wasn't part of Clearwater Cove at all. It sat just beyond the line, on its own legal parcel. Ethan could have left it there. He could have smiled, thanked the officers, and gone back to his chair. But as he looked at Marge's expression, the outrage mixed with disbelief, the way her eyes darted to the deputies as if searching for backup, he knew something else was coming. Marge didn't lose gracefully. That night, as the sun dipped below the trees and the lake turned gold, Ethan locked the cabin and headed home. But Marge stayed up late, pacing her living room, phone in hand, typing out a series of increasingly desperate emails, first to the HOA board, then to the county assessor, then to the sheriff's office again. She claimed there had been a trespasser, that property lines were unclear, and that she feared for the safety of her community. By morning, she'd printed copies of everything and slid them into labeled folders, determined to prove herself right. She didn't realize that in doing so, she had set in motion a chain of events that would turn the entire HOA upside down, because the land records, she demanded, would not only confirm that the cabin wasn't part of the HOA, they would also uncover something much more inconvenient for her. Something buried in the legal documents she had never bothered to read. Something that proved she was the one who didn't belong. And by the time the sheriff returned to Clearwater Cove, it wouldn't be to question Ethan, it would be to serve Marge an eviction notice. The next morning, the lake was quiet again, but the stillness was deceptive. Beneath the calm surface of Clearwater Cove, tensions were starting to ripple. Unseen, but inevitable, Marge Hollingsworth began her day the same way she always did. A pot of coffee, a check on her gardenias, and a stack of papers spread across her dining table like a general's war map. Except this time, it wasn't her HOA newsletter or minutes from the last board meeting. It was county property records, boundary maps, and a half-dozen printouts from government websites she barely understood. She had spent most of the night hunched over her computer, trying to prove what the deputies had refused to believe, that the cabin belonged to Clearwater Cove. She wasn't going to let some stranger stroll in, install locks, and claim a community asset. Not on her watch, not while she was still chair of the Preservation Committee. But as the sun climbed higher, she found herself lost in a tangle of legal jargon and parcel numbers that didn't line up the way she expected. The lakefront parcels were old, older than the HOA itself. Many had been privately owned long before Clearwater Cove was ever platted. Her pen scratched angrily against the page as she drew and redrew the boundary lines on her homemade map. The cabin's lot, parcel 17B, sat just outside the HOA's official border. The very edge, just outside. That couldn't be right, she thought. It didn't make sense. She flipped through another document, then another, each confirming the same thing. The cabin wasn't within Clearwater Cove at all. For a brief moment, Marge considered that she might be wrong. But the thought was unbearable. Instead, she convinced herself that there must be an error in the records. A clerical mistake. The county was sloppy, after all. She'd dealt with them before. By noon, she had made up her mind. She would go down to the county assessor's office herself and set the record straight. Across the lake, Ethan returned to the cabin with a cooler of food and a quiet sense of satisfaction. He'd spent years thinking of this place as something fragile, something he had to protect. But now, standing on the porch with the keys in his hand, it felt solid again. His grandfather had built it with his own two hands, back when this land was nothing but pine forest and marsh. No one had ever questioned who owned it until now. Still, he couldn't shake the image of that woman with the clipboard, the look on her face when the deputy told her the truth. He half expected her to show up again, but the day passed in peace. The only sounds were the wind in the trees and the soft hum of his drill as he worked on restoring the old dock. He didn't know that Marge was, at that very moment, standing in the assessor's office downtown, arguing with a clerk who had seen her kind more times than he cared to remember. The clerk, a man named Alan, had worked in county records for 23 years. He'd met plenty of people convinced that the government had drawn the wrong line on a map. He recognized the type immediately. Meticulous, stubborn, absolutely certain that they knew more than the professionals. Marge leaned across the counter, waving a folder full of highlighted printouts. "This parcel here," she said, tapping the page, "has been part of our community for decades. There must be a mistake." Alan peered at the document, then typed a few numbers into his computer. A moment later, he pulled up the official records. His tone remained polite, practiced, but firm. The property in question, he explained, had been deeded to the McConnell family, Ethan's family, since 1963. The deed had been properly recorded. Taxes paid every year, no liens, no encumbrances, no HOA covenants. Marge's lips tightened. She asked to see the HOA boundaries. He obliged, printing a copy from the county's GIS system. She stared at the map, tracing the red outline with a shaking finger. The cabin's lot was clearly outside it, not even close. For the first time in her long career of neighborhood micromanagement, the evidence didn't bend to her will. It stared back at her, black and white, unmoving, but then something else caught her eye. Just below the HOA's boundary line, her own property's lot. Parcel 23A. She frowned. That couldn't be right either. According to the map, her own house sat partially outside the official HOA zone. Her breath caught. She checked the address again, then the parcel ID. The numbers matched. The realization hit her like a slow-moving wave. She wasn't actually within the HOA's jurisdiction either. For all her years of enforcing rules, she might not have legally been under them at all. She stood there for a long moment, gripping the counter as her world began to unravel. Alan cleared his throat and asked if she needed any copies. She shook her head slowly, muttering something about checking with the HOA attorney. When she stepped outside into the parking lot, the sun felt too bright, the air too heavy. She drove home in silence, her thoughts looping endlessly. She couldn't be wrong. She wouldn't be wrong. By the time evening fell, the rumors had already started spreading through Clearwater Cove. Marge had been seen at the county office, asking about boundary lines. A few neighbors speculated she was trying to expand the HOA's reach again, a move she'd attempted before. Others, who'd grown tired of her constant rule enforcement, whispered that maybe she'd finally gone too far. Ethan, oblivious to the gossip, spent that evening cleaning the inside of the cabin. Dust floated through the air like soft snowflakes. He found old photographs of his grandfather holding a string of trout by the dock, his smile broad and easy. There was a peace in those pictures that Ethan hadn't felt in years. But peace, as always, was temporary in Clearwater Cove. The next morning, a letter appeared in Ethan's mailbox, not from the HOA, but from the county itself. It was a notification of a pending review request filed by one Margaret Hollingsworth, disputing the parcel boundaries surrounding Clearwater Cove. The letter wasn't a threat, but it was an annoyance, a bureaucratic spark that could take months to resolve. He sighed, folded the letter, and tossed it onto the counter. He wasn't worried. The truth was on his side. But he also knew people like Marge didn't stop when they were wrong. They doubled down, and sure enough, across the lake, Marge was drafting emails again. Not to the county this time, but to her lawyer, to the HOA board, to anyone who might listen. Her hands trembled as she typed, her confidence cracking but her pride still burning. She told herself she was protecting her community. She told herself she was right. But deep down, beneath all the denial and self-righteousness, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Fear, because if the county's records were correct, if her own property wasn't technically part of Clearwater Cove, then the HOA's rules she had enforced for years didn't apply to her either. The power she'd built her identity on was built on sand, and soon the whole community would find out. By Monday morning, Clearwater Cove was humming with whispers. The story had spread faster than the morning paper ever could. The woman who'd spent years policing mailbox colors, enforcing lawn heights, and issuing fines for unsightly holiday decorations had apparently been living outside the HOA's jurisdiction all along. At first, the residents didn't believe it. Some laughed it off as gossip. But when copies of the county map began circulating, printed from the public records site, highlighted in red and yellow, disbelief turned into amusement, and amusement quickly turned into outrage. Marge Hollingsworth, the self-appointed guardian of Clearwater Cove's community standards, had fined over a dozen homeowners for minor violations in the past year alone. She had forced one family to remove their children's treehouse for being too visible from the lake. She had reported another for using non-conforming mulch. And now, the evidence suggested she had no legal authority to do any of it. The HOA board, long accustomed to Marge's overbearing presence, found themselves under pressure. Emails poured in from residents demanding an explanation. The board president, a mild-mannered accountant named Robert Keller, called for an emergency meeting in the clubhouse. That evening, the parking lot filled with SUVs and sedans. Porch lights flickered across the lake as neighbors gathered, muttering and clutching printouts. Marge arrived early, as she always did, clutching her binder and forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Inside, the meeting room was crowded. Folding chairs lined the walls, and the air was thick with anticipation, the kind that only builds when people sense a reckoning coming. Robert opened the meeting with his usual politeness, but the tension was palpable. He cleared his throat, read the agenda, and then, carefully, brought up the issue everyone was waiting for: parcel boundaries. He explained, in calm, deliberate tones, that the county assessor's office had confirmed that certain properties, including Marge's own, were technically outside the official boundaries of Clearwater Cove. He emphasized that the board was working to understand what that meant for past enforcement actions. A low murmur rolled through the crowd. Marge shifted in her seat, her smile tightening. She waited for her chance to speak, then rose to her feet, binder in hand. She launched into a speech about community pride, about maintaining standards, about how she'd spent years protecting property values. But her words fell flat. The faces staring back at her weren't impressed anymore. They were tired. For years, the residents had put up with her because it was easier than fighting back. But now, stripped of her authority, Marge looked less like a protector and more like a busybody who had built her power on nothing but noise. Someone, from the back, a man who'd once been fined for leaving his garbage bins out overnight, asked if the HOA planned to refund those fines. Another demanded to know whether Marge's actions had been officially sanctioned. Robert hesitated, then admitted that most of her enforcement notices had not come from the board directly, but from her self-created committee. The room erupted. Marge tried to speak again, but the sound of raised voices drowned her out. For the first time in years, she wasn't the one in control. When the meeting finally ended, she left without a word. Her clipboard hung limply at her side, and her heels clicked sharply on the tile. Outside, the cool night air hit her face like a wave. She climbed into her SUV, locked the doors, and sat there in silence, staring at her reflection in the rearview mirror. Across the lake, Ethan sat on the porch of his cabin, unaware of the chaos unfolding in the clubhouse. The moonlight danced on the water, and the forest hummed with the soft rhythm of crickets. He had spent the day sanding the dock and painting the railings. For him, the world had returned to something resembling normal. But normal never lasted long in Clearwater Cove. The next morning, an envelope appeared on his truck windshield. Inside was a letter. Not from Marge this time, but from the HOA board. It was polite, almost apologetic, and explained that a review was underway to clarify the property boundaries and resolve community misunderstandings. Ethan smiled faintly. It was clear that Marge's crusade had backfired, and now the board was trying to clean up the mess. Still, he decided it was best to keep his distance. He came to the lake for peace, not politics. He locked the cabin, loaded his truck, and drove home. Meanwhile, Marge's world continued to unravel. The day after the meeting, she received a letter from the county. It was official notice that her property, Parcel 23A, was indeed located outside the Clearwater Cove HOA jurisdiction. The letter was short, factual, and devastating. That night, she sat at her kitchen table, the paper trembling in her hands. All her years of rules, all the fines and citations, all the arguments she'd won, they suddenly meant nothing. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe the boundaries could be redrawn? Maybe she could petition the HOA to annex her property formally. Maybe, she thought, she could still fix this. But her email inbox told a different story. The board had voted to suspend her Community Preservation Committee indefinitely. Several homeowners were threatening legal action over her past fines. And the HOA's insurance policy didn't cover unauthorized enforcement. She wasn't just powerless now, she was potentially liable. The realization hit her like cold water. She had spent years enforcing order to feel secure, to feel important. And now that security had vanished, leaving only the hollow echo of her own arrogance. Late that night, her porch light flicked on as she stepped outside. Across the lake, she could see a faint glow from Ethan's cabin. The sight filled her with a bitter mixture of envy and resentment. He had become, unintentionally, the symbol of her downfall. The man who'd proven her wrong without even trying. She watched the reflection of his porch light shimmer on the water, and something dark began to stir inside her. A thought she couldn't quite shake. If she couldn't fix her reputation by proving herself right, maybe she could at least make sure he didn't get the satisfaction of winning. The next morning, she began making calls. First to a friend on the county zoning board, asking vague questions about unregistered structures. Then to an environmental officer, inquiring about shoreline regulations. Finally, to a private surveyor, a man she'd hired before to settle a dispute over a neighbor's fence. She told herself it wasn't revenge. It was due diligence, just making sure everything near the lake was up to code. But deep down, she knew exactly what she was doing. If she couldn't control her community anymore, she would at least control the narrative. And soon, she thought, the man in that old fishing cabin would have more problems than a new lock on his door. The wind shifted over Clearwater Lake that week, both literally and figuratively. What had begun as quiet resentment among neighbors had grown into something heavier. Every driveway conversation, every Facebook group post, every morning walk carried whispers of Marge's downfall. Some were gleeful, others cautious, but all shared the same sentiment. She had gone too far for too long, and now the tide was turning. But Marge herself refused to see it that way. She woke each morning with renewed determination, her mind buzzing with new plans to restore order. The letter from the county still sat on her table, folded and refolded until the edges frayed. But she treated it like a temporary setback, something that could be corrected with persistence. She told herself she wasn't defeated. Not yet. Her latest idea had taken shape over coffee one restless morning. If she couldn't challenge Ethan's ownership directly, she could challenge how he used the property. After all, Lakefront preservation laws were notoriously strict, and she knew how to twist bureaucratic language better than anyone. She started with a complaint to the county environmental office. It was written with the precision of a legal document. Words like unauthorized modification, shoreline disruption, and non-compliant structure sprinkled throughout. She claimed that Ethan's renovations were damaging the ecosystem and that his cabin might be in violation of setback regulations. Then she contacted a private inspector she'd hired once before, a man named Gerald Pike, who had a reputation for finding issues wherever clients wanted him to. She told him she needed a thorough inspection of a property on the lake, framed as a community concern. She didn't mention that it wasn't actually within her HOA's jurisdiction. By Friday morning, the pieces were in motion. Ethan arrived at his cabin to find 2 county vehicles parked near the gravel drive. The inspectors introduced themselves politely, explaining that they'd received an anonymous complaint regarding possible environmental violations. Ethan, confused but cooperative, showed them around. They took photos, measured distances from the dock to the waterline, and inspected the new locks and solar lights. Everything was by the book. Still, the sight of them there, uninvited, clipboard in hand, stirred an unease in him. He knew who was behind it. He didn't have to ask. When they left, they told him the report would likely come back clean. Ethan thanked them, but the moment they drove away, he felt a familiar anger rise. This wasn't about environmental concerns. It was about harassment. He sat on the porch, staring across the water at Marge's house. Her blinds were open, just enough to reveal her silhouette. Watching. Always watching. Over the next few days, the pattern repeated. A zoning officer stopped by, citing a routine check. A county surveyor appeared without notice, asking to verify the property line markers. Even a wildlife officer visited, following up on an anonymous tip about illegal fishing activity. Each time, Ethan cooperated. Each time, the officials found nothing wrong. But the interruptions chipped away at his patience. His weekends at the lake, once his refuge, now felt like battles of endurance. The final straw came on a Tuesday afternoon. He had just finished re-staining the dock when he heard the sound of footsteps behind him. Turning around, he saw Gerald Pike, the private inspector, standing there with a clipboard and a smirk that didn't belong. Gerald claimed to be conducting an independent inspection on behalf of a concerned community member. He demanded access to the cabin's interior, citing possible safety hazards. Ethan refused, firmly but calmly. The man persisted, waving his credentials like a weapon, until Ethan informed him that he was trespassing and would be reported if he didn't leave immediately. Gerald muttered something about people who think they're above the rules before trudging back up the trail. Ethan watched him go, jaw tight. By sunset, he'd had enough. He gathered the contact information from every official who had visited, compiled the reports, and filed a formal harassment complaint with the county sheriff's office. He attached copies of the property deed and emails confirming that all inspections had been triggered by anonymous calls traced to the same number. One registered to Margaret Hollingsworth. It took less than a week for the sheriff to act. The morning, the patrol car pulled into Marge's driveway. She was trimming her hedges. She froze at the sound of the crunching gravel. The deputy who stepped out was calm, professional, but firm. He explained that the county had received multiple false or misleading reports traced back to her. Marge tried to play innocent. She insisted she was only doing her duty as a community watchdog, that she had every right to report suspicious activity. The deputy listened, then handed her a formal warning for harassment and misuse of public resources. He told her plainly, if she continued, she could face legal action. The color drained from her face as she read the paper. It wasn't an arrest, not yet, but it was a mark, a warning, a humiliation. When the deputy left, She stood in her driveway staring at the lake, trembling. Across the water, she could see Ethan's truck parked by the cabin. She thought of all the times she'd felt powerful, all the moments she believed she was the protector of Clearwater Cove, and realized how quickly that illusion had vanished. The HOA meeting that week sealed her fate. Word of the sheriff's visit spread before the evening was over. Residents showed up eager for confirmation. Robert Keller, the board president, stood at the podium and confirmed what everyone already suspected. Marge had been formally warned by the county for harassment. The room erupted in murmurs, some gleeful, others uncomfortable. Robert then announced that the board had voted unanimously to remove Marge from all volunteer positions within the HOA. Her committee was dissolved permanently. For the first time, Marge didn't speak. She sat in the back of the room, pale and silent, clutching her binder like a life raft. Her eyes darted from face to face. People she'd once scolded, fined, or lectured, all looking at her with a mix of satisfaction and pity. When the meeting ended, no one approached her. The woman who once commanded the neighborhood's attention now faded quietly into its background. That night, Clearwater Cove felt different, lighter somehow. The lake shimmered in the moonlight, free from her constant watch. But for Marge, the silence was unbearable. Her identity, built entirely on control, had crumbled. Her mind circled endlessly, searching for a way to reclaim what she'd lost. Then came a knock on her door. When she opened it, she found a courier holding an envelope from the county sheriff's office. Her heart lurched. She tore it open and read the contents. It wasn't another warning. It was a summons. Her harassment complaint hadn't just been logged. Ethan had filed a civil claim. The words blurred before her eyes, but one phrase stood out clear as glass. Pending review of nuisance and harassment actions. And below that, a note indicating that further investigation into her property ownership status was underway. Marge sank into a chair, the paper trembling in her hands. She thought she had seen the worst of it, but the real storm, the one she had stirred up herself, hadn't even begun. Autumn crept slowly across Clearwater Lake. The leaves along the shoreline had turned copper and gold, drifting down to the water's surface like scattered coins. Mornings came colder now, and the mist that hung over the lake seemed thicker, as if the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. It had been 3 weeks since the sheriff's warning. 3 weeks since Marge Hollingsworth's world had begun collapsing in on itself. She had stopped attending HOA meetings. Her once meticulous garden had grown wild, hedges overgrown, flower beds bare. The neighbors who used to avoid her now passed her house without a glance. Her emails to the board went unanswered. Her clipboard, that symbol of her control, sat untouched on the kitchen counter, gathering dust. But Marge wasn't done fighting. In her mind, she had been wronged, humiliated, lied about, and cornered. The civil claim Ethan had filed had shaken her, but she convinced herself she could still win. She began spending her days at the courthouse, poring over land deeds and HOA records, searching for some loophole, some overlooked technicality that would put her back in power. She found none. What she did find, however, was a letter buried deep in the county's files. A notice from nearly 2 decades earlier that her own property, Parcel 23A, had been flagged for code violations when the developer first built the subdivision. The notice had been marked unresolved. The developer had gone bankrupt before fixing it, and the file had simply been forgotten. Marge's heart sank as she read it. The document listed several issues: unpermitted grading, improper drainage, and, most crucially, construction encroachment beyond the approved boundary line. The signature at the bottom was faded, but the meaning was clear. Her property had never been officially cleared for residential occupancy. It wasn't just that she wasn't part of the HOA. Technically, Her house itself was sitting in violation of county code. She sat in the courthouse reading room for a long time, staring at that page. The walls seemed to close in around her. She'd spent years using the rules as a weapon, and now those same rules had turned on her. When she returned home that evening, the lake looked darker than she remembered. The water reflected the clouds above like rippled glass. She closed her blinds and locked her doors, as if that could keep the consequences out. But the consequences were already on their way. Across the lake, Ethan sat on his cabin porch, sipping coffee and watching the sunrise. The legal process had been slow but steady. The county had investigated his complaint thoroughly, reviewing Marge's history of false reports and her pattern of harassment. The officials had been patient but firm. They'd seen enough of her interference to act decisively this time. When Ethan received a call from the sheriff's office confirming that an order had been approved, he felt something shift inside him. Not triumph, not vengeance, but closure. The situation had gone far enough. It was time for it to end. That Friday morning, the sheriff's car returned to Clearwater Cove. This time, there were two vehicles, one marked, one unmarked. Word spread fast. Neighbors peeked from windows as the cruisers rolled down the quiet street, gravel crunching under their tires. Marge was in her living room when she saw them pull in. Her stomach dropped. For a moment, she considered hiding, pretending she wasn't home. But the sharp knock at the door came before she could move. She opened it slowly, her voice trembling as she greeted the deputy. The same man as before, calm, polite, but no longer patient. He handed her a thick envelope and explained in measured tones that the county had concluded its investigation. The findings were clear. Her property sat partially on land zoned as environmental buffer, land never intended for residential construction. Her house was classified as an illegal encroachment. She was being issued a formal notice of violation and, pending appeal, an order to vacate. For a moment, Marge couldn't breathe. She stared at the papers, the words swimming on the page. Order to vacate. The phrase echoed in her mind, twisting and hollow. The deputy continued, explaining that she had 30 days to appeal the decision or relocate. She barely heard him. Her mind was spiraling, flashing through the years, all the fines, all the lectures, all the smug satisfaction she'd taken in telling others to follow the rules. Now the rules had turned on her completely. When the deputies left, she sank onto her porch steps. Across the water she saw Ethan's cabin, the man she had called the cops on, the one she'd accused and harassed. And yet, there he was, still standing, unbothered, free. Her house, the one she'd once called the pride of Clearwater Cove, now felt like a tomb. Over the next week, the news spread like wildfire. The HOA board confirmed the county's findings at their next meeting. Residents were stunned. The woman who had ruled their neighborhood like a petty queen was now facing eviction from the very home she'd used as her throne. Some felt pity. Most didn't. Robert Keller, the HOA president, announced that the board would cooperate fully with the county but emphasized that the situation was outside HOA jurisdiction. It was a polite way of saying they wouldn't lift a finger to help her. Ethan didn't attend the meeting. He stayed by the lake, restoring his cabin's roof and fishing from the dock in the quiet mornings. The place finally felt like it should, peaceful, unbothered, and free from interference. He hadn't meant to destroy her life. He had only wanted her to leave him alone. But Clearwater Cove had a way of magnifying every act of pettiness until it became something larger, something unstoppable. Marge, meanwhile, spent her final weeks in silence. She filed an appeal, but the odds were against her. Her case was technical, old, and tangled in decades of zoning oversight. The county moved swiftly. On the final morning of her deadline, a moving truck sat in her driveway. The air was cool and damp, the sky overcast. She stood on her porch one last time, Looking out over the lake she had once believed she owned in spirit, if not in deed. The water didn't care. It shimmered as it always had, indifferent, eternal. She turned toward the house, its windows dark, its shutters crooked. It didn't look like hers anymore. It looked like something borrowed, something fragile, something that had never truly belonged to her. When the sheriff's vehicle arrived, she didn't argue. She simply handed over her keys and watched as they affixed the notice to her front door. The same deputy who had come weeks earlier gave her a sympathetic nod before turning away. Across the lake, Ethan watched quietly from his porch. He didn't feel joy or revenge, only an odd, solemn peace. The storm had finally passed. As Marge's moving truck rumbled up the hill, the lake settled back into stillness. The reflection of the trees rippled faintly across the water. Undisturbed at last, for the first time in a long while, Clearwater Cove felt like what it was meant to be. A quiet place, free from noise, rules, and self-made authority. And the old fishing cabin, standing steady by the shore, remained what it had always been, a small symbol of patience, outlasting pride.